Hello and welcome back to the Metahumanism podcast. If you're just joining me for the first time, my name is Bohdan, and I invite you to look at my introductory episodes, which specifically the first one where I describe who I am, where I come from, and what this channel is about. And I obviously invite you to explore all the other episodes that I've made so far. And read banned books is the message of the day. So today, last episode was focused on the on Hryhoriy Skovoroda's philosophy, who was could be described as the first genuinely Ukrainian philosopher. He lived in the 18th century, and he created this kind of unique synthesis of humanism and the Orthodox tradition. More specifically, his philosophy represents a synthesis of Neoplatonism, Stoicism, and the Orthodox tradition of hesychasm, which I talked about last time. So this time, what I want to do is kind of step back and take a look at and compare these traditions of Platonism and how they affected or influenced Skovoroda to make a more detailed analysis and comparison. So first I will look at Plato's philosophy, summarize it in a very relatively schematic manner, and then look at Neoplatonism as it was first developed and then adapted in Christianity, and then finally compare Skovoroda's own positions with all of these steps along the way. So let's begin. First is Plato, right? So Plato, just as by way of an introduction, he's obviously an enormous influence on the development of Western philosophy from ancient times and into the modern times. Even contemporary philosophers still kind of go back to Plato and either argue against him or for him, with him, depending on one's perspective. And his philosophy, philosophy existed before Plato, before Socrates, and it is known as pre-Socratic because it was kind of a watershed moment when Socrates and then Plato wrote about Socrates. Didn't write anything down. He only went around philosophizing, having dialogues with people, discussions, conversations, and only Plato and some other writers as well, like Xenophanes, they wrote about him, about Socrates. So we know about him from their writings. So Plato was Plato's written philosophy was a watershed moment because his philosophy spans nearly all major branches of contemporary philosophy as it is known, and in many ways the branches developed from that his effort and the academy he founded and the tradition that followed him, which became Platonism, and it'll be distinguished from his own philosophy. So his philosophy, as he wrote it, and we're just looking at what he wrote, and I will refer to specific dialogues because that was a major form of the way he wrote down his philosophy is in as dialogues, and that tradition became influential throughout the history of Western philosophy. So, and including Skovoroda, who wrote dialogues as well, and allegories. He turned to that, so that new influence from Plato and Neoplatonism influenced Skovoroda. So I'm going to look at each branch of philosophy as it is contemporary and summarize Plato's main ideas or main positions in that field. I think that's a good way to go about it. So let's start with the metaphysics or cosmology related fields. So cosmology is about cosmos, which is order or world, right? The universe. That was the concept in Greek times. The cosmos is order, chaos is kind of something opposite to the order of the world. That was just in schematic terms. So metaphysics, what it means is basically, the term was developed later, but basically it's something beyond the physical, so beyond this immediate material world we live in. So something that's beyond that. It's that branch talks about ontology, something that's being, the reality and what it consists of, and something that may not be readily available to our senses and to our understanding, that needs some intellectual insight. Okay, so the core idea in metaphysics that is attributed to Plato, comes from Plato, is a theory of forms or ideas. These are just different terms. Greek term was eidos. And sometimes people use that term specifically to avoid confusion, because today we use the word idea in many different connotations, and he used it in a very specific sense. So that's why sometimes it's called forms, is translated as forms in English. So or forms or ideas, and interchangeable in this with a capital I, interchangeable in this context. But I will continue using forms just to distinguish from the more typical use of the word idea. So the theory of forms is ultimate reality, consists of eternal non-physical forms, or these ideal forms, ideal notions, which are perfect, immutable templates of the imperfect things that we perceive, or the phenomena. All right. So, for example, this piece of paper, it's a specific object I can hold in my hands, and I can touch and feel and understand and see. But there exists an eternal form, which is paper, and that form is kind of a perfect instantiation of what paper is, and every single piece of paper kind of just participates in that ideal form, and is it just a phenomenal instance of this more ideal and more real, in Plato's understanding, form. So that's kind of this is the ancient idealism, philosophy of idealism, which was in modern times was also kind of rejuvenated in by Kant and his followers subsequently, German idealism as it is known. So, but anyway, so forms are the true reality for Plato, while material things are mere shadows or copies. Again, the form is ideal, true, and then material just copies of this something more real that is perfect and eternal. The form of the good is the highest of all forms, and it's the highest in the sense that it is the source of all being and of all intelligibility. So for him, we'll discuss epistemology in a second. So intelligibility, basically, that's what you can you use your intellect to to understand and to know intelligible things, right? So that form of the good was the highest form, and it was the source of being and intelligibility for him. Key dialogues in this in metaphysics, it's a Republic. That's a classic, books 5 to 7, where he talks about the theory of forms, form of the good, the divided line, and this is epistemology, how you kind of the difference between reality and phenomena, and then the allegory of the cave is also contained in those books. That's very famous, about how you gain knowledge and as if you were leaving a dark cave and going out into the light of the sun, and that's where how you achieve truth, how you learn truth as you learn and approach this realm of the forms and understanding of those ideal and eternal forms. You approach better wisdom and knowledge, and it's like light. For the first time seeing the light of the sun, when you lived in the cave all your life. So another dialogue here is Phaedo, argument for the immortality of the soul. world of forms is contrasted with the sensible world. And Timaeus, another key cosmological account of how the universe was created. And there are different ideas there. One of them is the product of a divine craftsman, or who he calls Demiurge. And this connects to later traditions in like Gnostic traditions in Christianity and beyond, and not just Christianity, just Gnosticism in general, where this idea of two worlds, and the Demiurge becomes an evil person creating this world, which is fallen and imperfect, and then there's something beyond this world which is perfect, and the true God is not the Demiurge, and so on. But that's not Plato. Plato just says that this is a divine craftsman. Demiurge is the term he uses, and this is just somebody who creates the world. And that's his account in Timaeus. It's a very peculiar sort of dialogue, very not like Plato. All most of the other dialogues focus on other things, but this Timaeus is very unique. And he also mentions this notion of hora, which is between the realm of. It's the only time he mentions this is in this dialogue, and he never develops that idea. It just mentioned once in the dialogue, and that it's something third in between, kind of the realm of the forms and the phenomenal world. He says there's something between that mediates between the two, and hora is something undefinable and hard to explain, where these forms leave their imprints, like a receptacle or like a womb. And so it's very, very interesting concept, and that's also been picked up by future philosophers in modern times, and trying to draw some parallels. But that's a matter for separate discussion anyway. But Timaeus, so this is something, if you're interested and want to explore, these are the Republic, Phaedo, and Timaeus are major dialogues focusing on metaphysics. There may be others, but those are the primary ones. Second is epistemology. So epistemology, as I already discussed in my previous videos, which I made, I decided to focus on epistemology first as I developed my channel here, my podcast. So it's about knowledge, right? So metaphysics more about how the world is made, reality, and epistemology is about knowledge and truth. Knowledge, episteme, for Plato was related to unchanging forms. So knowledge of those forms is episteme, and then opinion, or doxa, like orthodoxy, for example, that's where the word comes from. Opinion pertains to the changing sensory world. So anything we think we know about any phenomena around us or any objects, that's all opinion. And the only true knowledge, the episteme, is your knowledge, understanding of these unchanging forms, at least as far as Plato is concerned, obviously. So true knowledge is a recollection, or the Greek word is anamnesis, of the soul's prior acquaintance with the forms. So that's, again, the eternal soul idea that later also very influential in Christianity, already comes from Plato in a sense. So philosophy is a process of turning the soul away from the world of appearances towards the world of the truth and the ultimate reality, which is the forms. So that's what philosophy was about to him. Key dialogues in terms of epistemology is Meno, theory of recollection, paradox of inquiry is discussed in that. Then Theaetetus, I may mispronounce some of these, but these are Theaetetus. In-depth analysis of knowledge. So what is knowledge is defined in that dialogue. And it discusses and refutes several definitions of what knowledge is. And then last one is Phaedo. Again, I already mentioned it as in metaphysics, but sometimes these dialogues they don't really separate these matters clearly, because they are not. Knowledge is interdisciplinary, right? So Phaedo is recollection, and the immortality of the soul is discussed. And I will prepare some blog post about Skovoroda and about this because so I can give these references and put it in writing. It's easier, and I will link, and so you can refer to that if needed. So third area is logic and dialectic. So that's related. Logic is Aristotle was actually the one who formalized logic. Plato did not create like a separate logic, but he did develop a dialectic and an analytical method called dialectics, which is basically, and he considered that to be the highest method of reasoning. It's like a systematic dialogue that aims at discovering truth by analyzing concepts and definitions, right? So kind of following Socrates, who went around conversing with people and asking questions, it's something differently known as maieutic philosophy. Maieutic, it comes from Greek word for midwife, so it's kind of like you're trying to give birth to knowledge by asking questions and questioning people's assumptions, and in the process of dialogue you bring out the truth. So that's maieutic, and I'll refer to it in a second, also in the context of Neoplatonists. So the dialectic ascends through the forms to the form of the good. That's what Plato envisioned it as. And he uses Socratic questioning, which I just said, which the Greek term is elenchus, to expose contradictions in people's assumptions, right? So in what assumptions people generally make. So that method has become influential, and dialectics has become one of the major methods in philosophical tradition, Western specifically, throughout but it's not just Western. That method is used in other traditions, Buddhism and others, independently. So it's a very powerful and important methodology. So key dialogues in logic, discuss logic and dialectic is Republic again, book number 7. Dialectic as the highest intellectual activity is described there. Then there are two Sophist and Parmenides, two dialogues. They explore being, non-being, categories of thought, and its early moves toward ontology and logic. So it's Plato's kind of grappling with these ideas, but Aristotle is the one who actually systematizes and creates a logic as a discipline in a way. And then one more dialogue is Euthyphro, and that's Elenctic method in action. Elench meaning Socratic questioning, what is piety? Is that dialogue is focusing on the question, what is piety? And this method of questioning and trying to give birth to truth is exemplified in that. So next is ethics. The core idea here is the good life is one in which the soul is in harmony, governed by reason and oriented towards the form of the good, which is the highest of the forms. So virtue, or arete in Greek, is knowledge. No one does wrong willingly. So it's basically the connection is that if you're not virtuous, you're ignorant. That's why you're not doing what is right. It's a very kind of generous way of looking at things. The just soul mirrors the just city. So reason rules over spirit and appetite. So reason is the highest for Plato, and he saw this reflection of individual and collective, like the city, the community, and the individual were inextricably connected to him. And he didn't see them as separate, but as expressions of the same process, same kind of processes. Let's put it that way. Key dialogues here are Republic. Again, justice in the soul and in the city, so in both inside and outside in the community. And then the theory, a tripartite, a theory of the soul. The soul consists of 3 parts. And then Gorgias is the next critiques of hedonism and rhetoric, just like Socrates, well, I guess through Plato, right? So he opposed the sophistry and the rhetoric, which I mentioned in my previous videos discussing epistemology. In Renaissance, this was also revived, the battle between the rhetoric and philosophy and logic, and so ethical superior between things and words, if you remember res verbum controversy. So ethical superiority of the just life is mentioned in Gorgias also. Next dialogue, Phaedo. Again, this is the third time I'm mentioning this, so an important dialogue, obviously. The philosopher's life as preparation for death is discussed in Phaedo, and it just kind of theorizes what philosopher's life is all about. And then Meno, again, can virtue be taught, is the question explored in that one. Can virtue be taught? So that's ethics. Next is aesthetics. So Plato aesthetic thought is ambivalent. He's famously, in his Republic, he actually, Republic was kind of his idealized description of what a perfect city, perfect community, political community would be. And in that, some people say that that is like a proto, well, we'll talk about that in next about politics, but here he in that Republic, he was proponent of excluding poets from the community completely, just banishing them from the community because he thought they were harmful to a harmonious living of a community. He recognized the emotional power of art. But he thought that because of its, so he criticized mimesis or mimetic illusion, mimetic meaning representation or imitation, that's a Greek word, and it's a very important concept too, throughout the philosophy to modern times, but he thought that the arts is an imitation of an imitation, because in his philosophy, the world of phenomena is already an imitation of a higher world of forms, right, in his mind. So arts, for him, is imitation of the world, which is already imitation of a higher realm. So it's like a copy of a copy, and it misleads, it's harmful, twice removed from the truth of the forms, and so he viewed it as harmful and that you can mislead, inflame passions, distort truth. But in some sense, he understood that myth and well-ordered poetry can serve philosophical and ethical education. But as I said, he in his this ideal city in Republic, this book 10 specifically, he's suggests that poets should be banished from the community, and critiques art as mimesis, as a copy of a copy, really. So Republic I already mentioned. Another dialogue that treats the aesthetic matters is Ion. Inspiration and the irrational nature of poetic genius is discussed there. And then Phaedrus. Phaedrus talks about positive role of beauty and love in elevating the soul. The form of the beauty also is important for him. He discusses that, but Phaedrus is one of the dialogues focusing on that. Next is politics, and this is what I wanted to say earlier, that some people, because of his the way he described this ideal community in the Republic, some people consider him to be the first kind of proto-totalitarian thinker, because he talked about the philosopher-kings that would be rule over the ideal state of which he wrote, kind of a utopian kind of you could say probably one of the earliest utopian descriptions of a community, that only these philosopher-kings are able to grasp this form of the good, and so only they are fit to rule. So a deeply aristocratic, kind of an exclusionary way of vision of a political system, and in that sense, certain elements of what he proposed were kind of in retrospect looked like proto-totalitarian suggestions, that where kind of life is controlled by all aspects of life are controlled by the community, and really it's so there has been criticism obviously, but Plato himself probably didn't envision it that way, but again, these are different interpretations, and they have a right to exist in a sense of how Plato is understood through the centuries, and how he is interpreted. So some of the seeds of these ideas are found here. So justice, Justice for him is a structural harmony among classes, or the rulers who have wisdom, the auxiliaries who have courage, and then the producers who have moderation. That's his vision. Advocate for meritocratic hierarchical society with communal property. So there's also element of communism in there, in some sense, like all the children are being raised together. There's no nuclear family. There's no you don't know whose children are whose. They're all raised together in a communal way, and family. So communal property and family among the guardian class. So it's very very kind of peculiar ideas from a modern point of view. Later dialogues critique or revise elements of this utopia. His later dialogue. So Plato is a complex thinker, and so that's why it's important to read different dialogues, read the source, and that's why it's important to distinguish later interpretations of his thought and from his own words. So key dialogues is Republic, obviously, again, politics, the utopia, kind of the blueprint of the ideal city. Justice is harmony. Laws is another important one here, more pragmatic, more detailed legal code for this second best state. So that was an ideal proposal, and this is laws were more about, I guess, more practical and pragmatic. The treatment of the same theme. And then statesman, or politikos in Greek, and that's differentiation of true statesmanship from tyranny and demagoguery. So it's an important dialogue as well. Now next we can discuss theology or philosophy of religion, or how Plato approached religion. So Plato's theology is rationalized and moralized. So reason is the highest human faculty for him, obviously intellect. But he saw gods as perfectly good, unchanging, and that's when I discussed mental health and suicide, he considered suicide to be evil because it went against the gods who gave you life, and taking your own life is a kind of sin against the gods who are all perfectly good. So they're perfectly good, unchanging, and not some anthropomorphic deities of popular religion. That's not what he believed in, anyway. So the Demiurge in Timaeus, which I mentioned, is a benevolent creator who orders the cosmos rationally, in his understanding, and the soul is immortal and divine in nature. That's Plato's position. So key dialogues, again, Timaeus, cosmology and theology is discussed. Demiurge, the world, soul, and concept like that. Phaedo, again, once more, afterlife and the soul's divine origin are mentioned there. And Euthyphro, which I already mentioned was important in a sense of logic and dialectic, and so it's also important in this case, discussion on piety and the nature of the gods, and so I mentioned it in logic because it's an example of how logic, dialectics, and this method, Socratic method, is used. But the theme is piety and the gods. And finally, one last branch, so to speak, is psychology or philosophy of mind. So Plato presents a tripartite soul, which I referred to just recently. Reason, logos, spirit is thymos, and also connected to emotion in some ways, and appetite, epithymia. So reason, spirit, and appetite, each with its own desires and functions, right? So the soul is immortal. It pre-exists and survives the body and is capable of ascending to truth. So ascending to the realm of forms using intellect to understand the forms. So see this idea of an immortal soul, that eternal soul, that also picked up by Christianity later. It's already exists in the Greek tradition. Key dialogues, Republic again, book number 4. Which talks about tripartite psychology, or the three-part soul. Phaedrus, where he describes reason as a charioteer of emotion. So the reason, as a charioteer allegory of the soul, that there is a charioteer who's kind of reason holds the reins of the chariot, and the chariot is your emotions and drives and desires. So that's kind of the metaphor, allegory he used, a famous allegory. And then Phaedo is, again, soul-body dualism is discussed there, the soul's liberation from the body also. So see certain amounts of when I talked about subject-object dualism in one of the previous episodes, I said that this was already started in ancient Greece. That's Plato for you. Okay, so now let's look at the Neoplatonists and see the differences between the two traditions, and how they interpreted and developed his philosophy. So Neoplatonism emerged roughly in the 3rd century of our millennia, our common era. So after Christ, in the 3rd century. So it's about half a millennia difference between a little bit more, but between Plato and Neoplatonism emerging. So primary exponent of Neoplatonism was Plotinus, and then later it was developed by thinkers like Porphyry, Iamblichus, Proclus, and Damasius. So those are the major names in the tradition. So it's a reinterpretation, and a metaphysical intensification of Plato's philosophy. So it integrated mysticism into his system, more metaphysical, but it becomes more metaphysical than Plato, and more religious cosmology is also included. So in the 3rd century, this is around the time, 2nd, 3rd century, especially, even first, 2nd, 3rd century was when Gnosticism and all these the Christianity was developing. Early Christianity and Gnosticism was pretty popular in those times, which ideas of these two worlds and Demiurge. And so Neoplatonism, in some ways, this is kind of I think Plato influenced those other Gnostic traditions as well in certain ways. Maybe not quite as directly as Neoplatonists, but so Neoplatonists kind of, it's in the same general historical moment when these ideas became more popular about mysticism, about religious cosmology, which we will be discussing, and they influenced Christianity subsequently as well, in many ways. So let's delve into Neoplatonism. So some of the core ideas here, and here I won't go into each branch, because I laid out the Plato's philosophy, so that's more or less the basis for Neoplatonists, and they just develop it further. So the major developments of Neoplatonists was, first of all, is the one, the idea of the one, in Greek terms, tohen. That's how it sounds, tohen. And so it's the ultimate principle. So it's beyond being, it's beyond intellect, it's beyond description, something unknowable. It's absolutely simple and ineffable source of all things. So already very different from Plato's notion you can use intellect to understand forms. So there's nothing beyond being, it's just that there's this more real reality. But for Neoplatonists, there is something beyond being, completely, utterly transcendent. That's what it means. Beyond this world, beyond being, beyond understanding. That is not accessible to anybody, even intellect, even the philosopher-kings of Plato. But it's a cause of everything, and and all reality emanates from the one. So not by will or creation. So it's not a will of the one to create something, or it's not a deliberate act of creation. It's just because the one is so plentiful and perfect, it overflows with this kind of perfection, and things emanate from this perfect source of everything. And so this doctrine of emanation, this was very common in those that historical period, and Gnostic traditions as well. So the emanation, and this is kind of there's some connection, cultural reference to the movie The Matrix, where you're talking about the one, right? So this idea of there being something, the one, something like the unity beyond this world that kind of unites everything. The source, right? The source, the original source. That's very Neoplatonic. So, and it influenced obviously the Christianity in a major way. Now, emanation and the great chain of being. So the emanation happens, the reality as it exists unfolds in a hierarchical manner. So it's series of what's called hypostases. So the one is this ineffable source which is inaccessible. Then nous, or divine intellect, that's a term which I talked about in noetics, nous, right, the intellect. That's the emanation of the one. Then the next level of emanation from the nous comes psyche, or world soul, and then from psyche come individual souls, and then from individual souls comes the matter. So that's kind of the hierarchy of closeness to the source, right? So each level is less unified and less real than the previous one. So the one is the ultimate reality, nous or the intellect is just below it, psyche or the soul is just below that, individual souls is below that, and then matter is completely at the bottom in this kind of hierarchy, right? So so unlike two-world metaphysics of Plato, where the realm of forms, the phenomenal world, the Neoplatonism imagines this continuous chain of being, a descent from the source from unity to multiplicity of the phenomena, right? And so so that was the second idea of this hierarchy, and then the third idea this is a return to the one. So called epistrophe is a Greek term. So the soul's goal is to reunify with the source, with the one, through contemplation, through spiritual purification, and philosophical mystical ascent. That's the idea of Neoplatonism. This return involves an inner dialectic, ethical purification, and ultimately mystical union, or in terms of Neoplatonists, henosis. And I discussed theosis in context of Skovoroda orthodoxy, and that's the same idea, but transplanted into the Christianity, and we'll talk about that in a second. But henosis, because tohen was the one, so henosis is the return to the one, right? So the mystical union back with the source. That was the what Neoplatonists developed out of Plato's ideas. Now, the later Neoplatonists, in their commentaries, I mentioned maieutic, like the Socratic dialogue, maieutic philosophy. So when they interpreted some of the, specifically a dialogue called Alcibiades I, that's Plato's dialogue, and thinkers like Proclus and Olympiodorus were the ones who were interpreting it, and they interpreted maieutic as the transition from ignorance to the true knowledge contained within the soul, so as ascent to wisdom. So maieutic for them was a way to achieve wisdom and truth, and they distinguished that from erotics, or ascent to the beauty. So that's how that process is kind of, they viewed it separately from maieutic. So erotics would be ascent to the beauty, maieutic ascent to wisdom and truth, and then dialectics ascent to the good, or the good is still very important. It was the highest form for the Plato, and it still plays an important part here. So dialectics is, for them, it's a third third dimension of ascent, and that's ascent to the good life, or the ethical life, and so on. So that's kind of three-dimensional conceptualization of what ascent means. And they distinguished maieutic, like this dialogue and conversation, from refutation, from direct rebuttal or the refutation of somebody's argument. It's like maieutic is more gentle and more kind of questioning process. And finally, fourth important idea of Neoplatonists was the role of beauty and love. It was already important for Plato, which I mentioned, but for Neoplatonists, beauty is a trace of the one in the world. So love, eros, for them is the soul's desire to ascend back towards the unity. That's how they theorized it. So art, music, and contemplation of beauty are all tools for spiritual awakening. So see a very different attitude towards arts. No sense of this hostility or hostility towards the arts, viewing it as something false and misleading. Just to summarize the thinkers, Plotinus was the founder of Neoplatonism. He emphasized the ineffable one and mystical ascent, and his major work is Enneads. It was actually compiled by Porphyry, who is the next thinker. He systematized Plotinus's thought, and he introduced Aristotelian logic into it. And his works were Life of Plotinus and Isagoge. And then next is Iamblichus. He emphasized theurgy, which is a ritual magic, over pure contemplation. And he wrote a work called De Mysteriis. And Proclus, final one that I will examine, was a codified Neoplatonist system and emphasized cosmic hierarchy. And his works include elements of theology and Platonic theology. So these are four important thinkers in that tradition, in the original Neoplatonist tradition. So just to summarize the distinction between Plato and Neoplatonism, first of all, the first principle for Plato was the form of the good, intelligible and knowable through dialectical method. For Neoplatonism, the highest principle, the first principle, is the one, and which is beyond being and knowledge and ineffable, right? So important distinction. Structure of reality, for Plato, it's dualistic, right? So the world of forms versus the phenomenal world or sensory world. For Neoplatonists, it becomes hierarchical. It's emanation from the one, through nous, through soul, and down to the matter. So it's not quite so separated and dualistic as it is in Plato. Epistemology, so for Plato, it's knowledge via dialectic and recollection of the forms. And for Neoplatonists, it was mystical ascent through contemplation, purification, and inner union, mystical union, right? So you see the difference. Cosmology, so for Plato, it's Demiurge shapes cosmos using forms. For Neoplatonists, it's emanation, right? So the cosmos unfolds spontaneously in a way from the overflow of the one, inevitable overflow of the one. Ethics, for Plato, it's harmonizing the soul through reason. For Neoplatonists, it becomes purification of the soul and spiritual ascent to the divine source. And finally, a role of the beauty. For Plato, it was bridge to the intelligible realm. And for Neoplatonists, it was trace of the one. It's a beauty incites eros towards unity. So these different approaches, and clearly this was a step forward between Plato and Christianity in a way, Christian thinking. So while Plato sometimes in his dialogues, he does talk about ineffable or mystical aspects, for example, Symposium is one dialogue, or Phaedrus, but Neoplatonism emphasizes the transcendence of the one, of the divine, to a much higher degree, and spiritualizes the entire philosophical journey as this ascent, spiritual ascent, which for Plato, it's more rationalist. In terms of Christianity, how it adapted Neoplatonism, first of all, just to reiterate again, Neoplatonism was extremely influential on Christianity, although it was adapted in a particular way, obviously. Thinkers like Augustine, St. Augustine, Pseudo-Dionysius, Origen, and then later Thomas Aquinas, drew from Neoplatonism in different ways, directly or indirectly. So that was influence early in Christianity, and then even later on it was still used in Skovoroda. Up to the times of Skovoroda, Neoplatonism was a source of these dialogues of Plato and works of Neoplatonists were studied and interpreted and so on and commented on. So what adaptations did Christianity introduce? So if we take the concept, Neoplatonic concept of the one, Christianity obviously becomes God, personal, omniscient, omnibenevolent, and benevolent, sorry, and omnipotent. Emanation becomes creation from nothing, ex nihilo, right? So God creates freely, not necessarily. So it becomes like an act of a will or willful, deliberate creation. So it's changed. The concept of nous or intellect and world soul, it becomes Christ or logos. It's the same principle, and Holy Spirit in Christianity. The mystical ascent in Neoplatonism is retained in certain traditions, and one of which was the Orthodox hesychasm, and which influenced Skovoroda. So retained in contemplative and mystical theology in Christianity, and there are some texts like a well-known text with an unknown author called Cloud of Unknowing. It's still considered a classic for understanding these kind of spiritual matters. And then Meister Eckhart is one mystical author in medieval philosophy. So a notion of evil as privation or lack of good. For Neoplatonists, same idea was confirmed or supported in Christianity. Augustine affirmed this approach, and evil is just a kind of not a substance or its own separate entity. It's just a lack of good. And this is one of the major differences between the mainstream Christianity and the Gnostic Christianity, where Gnosticism is more dualistic, and they see the Demiurge as evil, creating this world as to enslave the spirit and the soul as good, and trying to achieve ascent to God, to true God beyond this world. So that's just a different thing, but I wanted to add that additional dimension. And then finally, divinization in Neoplatonism with henosis, right, becomes theosis in Christianity, especially in Eastern Christian theology, which I influenced Skovoroda, which I mentioned last episode. Union with God through grace, union by through purification of your soul, and so on. So major distinctions, just to reiterate and emphasize, God's nature, for Neoplatonists, the divine was the impersonal one, beyond being. For Christianity, or Christian Neoplatonism, you can say, personal God, active in history, so a different conception of what God is or what divinity is. Cosmic process is, for Neoplatonists, is eternal emanation. It's just an internal process of emanating from the source. For Christianity, it's free act of creation in time, right? Different approach. Salvation for Neoplatonism was a self-directed ascent through philosophy and ritual, like magic, ritual magic, what I mentioned, theology. For Christianity, it's divine grace, sacraments, faith. Different emphasis completely. And then theurgy, the ritual magic, that was essential part of later Neoplatonism, at least, as it developed. But in Christianity, it's viewed as suspicion and even evil. It's magic as something from the devil, or rejected completely. So those are major distinctions. So those are basically three steps which lead up to Skovoroda. And just to summarize finally the final step of this journey that I've taken you on today, I'm just going to quickly reiterate Skovoroda's positions so you can compare them to Plato, Neoplatonism originally, and Christian adaptation of Neoplatonism. So for Skovoroda, the ultimate reality or the absolute principle, it's indivisible divine. God, obviously, he's a Christian. Within all, present in the heart. So it's a living inner truth for him. So slightly, again, different emphasis, not quite traditional Christianity as it, in the official doctrines or dogma. So this is an adaptation. Skovoroda made his own philosophy. So it's both transcendent and immanent, meaning immanent meaning in this world, present, and immediate presence. Transcendence is something beyond this world. That's a difference. So Skovoroda takes this evangelical statement, "The kingdom of God is within you," which is from Gospel of Luke. Literally, that your inner world is where God lives, in your heart. Epistemology. So for Skovoroda, knowledge and the soul. Skovoroda, he focuses on inner illumination. So in Christianity, it's divine illumination through grace and faith, as I just described. So Skovoroda, it's inner illumination, self-knowledge as a path to God. So know thyself. So you see this combination of earlier tradition of Plato, Neoplatonism, knowing yourself, reason, using reason, and Skovoroda combines that with orthodoxy, with divine illumination, and talks about inner illumination. So knowing one's true nature, which is divine and aligned with one's calling, srodnist, which I talked about last time. That's what the goal is of life, is to find your own nature and live according to it. Cosmology and structure of reality for Skovoroda, similarly to Plato and so on, there are two worlds: visible, external, and invisible, internal. So for him, he has this symbolic metaphysics. It's not so much dualistic as there is a separate realm of forms, but there's a world which is beyond what we see, which is inner world of spirituality and symbolism, and that's where he focuses on. So matter for him is not evil, but simply a veil for deeper spiritual things, needs to be interpreted spiritually. Language of symbols. He used, as I mentioned last time, he used a lot of parables, biblical and folk metaphors, similarly to Christ's teachings, but also dialogues as Plato used. Anthropology, the nature of the human being. For Skovoroda, it's dual nature: external body and internal true self. So soul is divine, reflective of God. You can compare it to what I just mentioned about Plato and on Platonism and Christianity. So the goal of life is to live in harmony with this, as I said, with this inner nature, with this inner true self, and divine image, and joy and simplicity are signs that you're aligned with your calling. So again, ethics and way of life, just to kind of re-emphasize again, good life is a life of inner freedom, self-knowledge, spiritual joy, simplicity, and integrity. For Skovoroda, method he uses is inner listening, self-cultivation, heart philosophy, biblical wisdom. Ethical ideal for him is wise person, sort of like a philosopher, mudrec in Ukrainian, so wisdom, wise person, sage, who lives in harmony with himself or herself and the world, right? So that's the highest ideal, ethical ideal. Aesthetics and the symbolic. For Skovoroda, world is a book of symbols. Everything has an inner divine meaning, and you need to learn to interpret it and to tease out that inner meaning. So he uses biblical parabolic language, parables, Ukrainian folklore, Baroque poetic style, and to get his message across. Political and social philosophy for Skovoroda was largely non-political, suspicious of state and hierarchy. As I said, he refused all these different jobs and to make a career within the church or in imperial structures at the time, and so spiritual freedom over external order was for him more important. He was skeptical of church hierarchy, titles, wealth, and he promoted inner truth and equality, really. So that was his emphasis. So in terms of in terms of mysticism and union, Skovoroda focused on unity through the heart, lived wisdom, inner peace, no separation between sacred and secular life. So he didn't see this as a different realm or as a kind of ascent to something beyond this world. There may be a God beyond, but he focused on life in this world and how to lead the best life in this world, and through the heart is the way forward for him, by embodying the wisdom and peace in your life here on earth. So no separation between spirituality and ethics and kind of, you know, wholesomeness in your life. That's the goal. So for him, for a language of ascent, he was influenced by these ideas of Neoplatonism. So spiritual journey up inward, into the kingdom within, kingdom of heaven within. Sort of that's what he what his approach was. No rigid stages or to rituals. It's just this kind of journey inward and knowing yourself and thus knowing the world. That's more or less, I think, summarizes everything I wanted to lay out. I wasn't sure whether I was gonna fit it into one episode, but I managed to do so. So again, just to recap, we talked about Plato and his the theory of the forms, form of the good being the highest one, and kind of this two world. His ideas on various topics and about perfect community and so on. Then Neoplatonism, which developed, refocused his philosophy, made it more metaphysical, more mystical, and more spiritual, and introduced this concept of the one, the hierarchy of being. The one is unintelligible, not accessible through reason and intellect, and the soul wants to return to the one, to the source, which everything emanates from the one. And so the philosophy and life, the goal of life, is to move as close back up to the source as possible, right? So that's very slightly different emphasis from what Plato himself. And then Christianity adopted it, obviously turning everything into Christian ideas of God and soul and spirit and holy, and God being a creator and so on. So shift again, another shift in meaning. And then Skovoroda combined a little bit of Neoplatonism and orthodoxy together with Stoicism as well. And this, which is what I will examine next time, the Stoic tradition, its development, and how it affected, how it was adapted in Christianity, and how it influenced Skovoroda subsequently. So thank you for being with me, and again, support Ukraine if you're not supporting yet. Ukraine can and will win. This war is absolutely criminal, and there is no other way than for Ukraine to stay strong until they prevail. And the only matter is of the world standing firm along with Ukraine and supporting Ukraine sufficiently to win this war. And support this my content if you can. At the least, like, share, comment if you have any comments, and I'll see you next time.